Let me say welcome on behalf of everyone in this panel. Welcome to the webinar on regulatory tools for gender equality in mining, jointly organized by the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals and Sustainable Development, or IGF for short, and the Responsible Mining Foundation, RMF. My name is Tekinbas, and I'm the Gender Equality Advisor for IGF. Our participants probably know about the IGF, but still let me say a few words to introduce our work. We are the Secretariat of a global forum representing 79 governments from mine-producing countries all over the world, aiming to achieve poverty reduction, inclusive growth, social development, and environmental stewardship in the mining sector. And as an organization devoted to optimizing the benefits of mining, we are very happy to co-host today's webinar on regulatory tools for gender equality in mining. I want to open this webinar by acknowledging that mining operations change societies. They transform people's livelihoods, way of life, cultural traits, political systems, community structures, and also power dynamics within the societies. And women are an essential part of this change, as we make up a significant portion of the world's mining workforce, and we make up half of every community that mining operation takes place. So, however, we do not reap the mining benefits equally, as we all know today, but we are rather disproportionately affected by its costs. And this is why we need to talk about gender equality and mining governance, so that we can build stronger communities and we can achieve a mining sector that is not only stable, but also just and equitable. On the other hand, today, gender equality is clearly a challenge for the mining industry. We know that companies need to be proactive in counteracting potential unintended and negative effects of the industry on women. However, as the research shows, as my co-host Jennifer will detail today, we know that such gender responsive measures, while well implemented by some companies, are still far from being the standard practice in the industry. This puts the governments in a very critical position. Governments in resource-rich countries have a vital role in terms of setting regulatory frameworks to ensure gender-responsive mining operations by the industry. So today's key question is how public and corporate policies together drive change towards gender equality in the mining sector. In order to partially answer this question, IGF has recently released a report that provides governments with a series of 25 policy options. I will not repeat all these policy options today, but if you want to know more about these policy options that we provided, please visit the gender page of the IGF website. I will soon be posting the link in the chat box as well. But before turning to our panelists, I want to say a few words about these policy options that we as IGF put together. While writing about policy options for governments, we grouped the recommended good practices under 5 main categories. And these 5 categories are legislation, land acquisition, impact assessments, community development, and legal protection for women. And these recommendations demonstrate that governments can undertake a regulatory role to make sure that mining-related policy frameworks are supportive of gender equality. But in addition to this regulatory role, we also underlined that governments can become active agents driving change by investing in gender equality themselves. And today we will explore some good government practices that showcase both of these actions in practice, and in other words, they will show us how public policies on gender equality and women's empowerment can be spearheaded in the mining sector. We are very lucky today to host 2 very inspiring examples. Mr. Min On, Acting Deputy Director of National Resources Canada, and Ms. Maripaz Rodriguez Mier, Gender Equality Lead of the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Colombia, will explain to us how they ensured that gender equality is properly addressed in their respective mining policy frameworks. Also, we will have a chance to see the global picture thanks to the comprehensive research that had been undertaken jointly by the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI, in partnership with the World Resources Institute, and to be presented to us today by Ms. Aubrey Menard, Senior Policy Advisor for Extractive Industries at Oxfam America. Today, we will also explore good corporate practices, good corporate policies that support gender equality and women's empowerment in the mining sector, thanks to the intervention by Ms. Hermien, Head of Sustainability Engagement of Anglo American, and Jennifer Rietbergen-McCracken, Senior Advisor of the RMF, the co-host of today's webinar, will tell us about mining company performances on gender equality by providing examples of regulations that make difference. And I want to start today's panel with Jennifer Rietbergen from Responsible Mining Foundation. I believe everyone has heard of the Responsible Mining Index that RMF put together. So just to remind, Responsible Mining Index is a biennial assessment of mining companies' policies and practices on economic development, business conduct, life cycle management, community well-being and working conditions, and also environmental responsibility, with gender and human rights issues integrated throughout the report. As the RMF is the only independent organization that publishes transparent assessment of company policies and practices, I believe Jennifer can help us frame the discussions of today by providing us a snapshot of the current state of play. So Jennifer, when you analyze the findings of the RMI report that you compiled together, what have you found in terms of mining company performances on gender equality, and what are the major gaps where regulations can make a difference?
Many thanks, Ege, and I'd like to start by saying it's a real pleasure for RMF to be co-hosting this webinar with IGF today on such an important topic. And it's great to have so many people joining us on this event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions. So before highlighting some of our findings on gender equality in mining, it might be helpful to give a little bit of background first on the Responsible Mining Index, or RMI reports. RMF produces these reports every 2 years. The most recent one came out in 2020, and the next one will be published in February 2022. And actually we'll give a few previews of these draft results on gender from this upcoming report in a moment. The RMI report covers these 6 areas encompassing economic development, environmental, social, and governance issues. And gender as a transversal issue is integrated across the assessment framework. The scope of the assessment is shown here. This slide has a lot of information, but basically the shaded countries show the geographic footprint of the 38 companies assessed in the RMI report 2020. And together these companies account for approximately 28% of global mining production. And a final word about the assessment: it is evidence-based, meaning that all answers to the questions need to be backed up by documentary evidence. It is desk-based, using publicly available data. And it is based on what society can reasonably expect of mining companies, drawing on RMF's extensive consultations and discussions with a wide range of stakeholders in producing countries around the world. So taking into account all of the 16 metric questions on gender-related issues, we can see that the overall results are very weak. So each bar on this chart represents one company. And as we can see, even the tallest bar is pretty short. And we were actually surprised at just how low these company performances are, given the huge global attention on gender over the last years, and also the various initiatives on gender in the mining sector. And if we look at how the RMI 2022 results look like so far, we can see, if you just glance at that chart, we can see now there is a slight improvement over the last 2 years, but only by a few percentage points in each case. If we then unpack these results a little bit, let's look first of all at gender action within mining companies. We can see that most of the efforts companies are making on gender are focused very much on improving gender balance of their boards and their senior management teams. This is what the left-hand chart shows. This is encouraging, but still, by contrast, as we can see in the right-hand chart, very few companies can actually show systematic action to make sure that their women workers have appropriate PPE, which is, of course, a much more fundamental issue of health and safety at the mine site. Again, if we look at this 2020 results compared to 2022, again, we see a slight increase, but still a strong contrast between how the level of action on both of these issues. Then perhaps an even more striking result is shown here. This is in fact showing a generalized lack of action to protect women workers from sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And we know that studies and surveys continue to show that these risks are still a daily reality for many women mining workers. Again, we can see a slight increase in the 2022 results, but still the problem is still vast compared to the action that is taking place on it. And I know this is a key area of focus for the gender equality work of the Colombian government, which Marie will be talking about later. Looking now at gender actions at the community level, here we see a very straightforward result. Less than half of the companies can show that they are ensuring that their community engagement activities reach out to women as well as men. And it is clear that without such special measures, women are often excluded from the discussions and the decision-making. And when it comes to benefit sharing, we see a similar picture. Here in local procurement, for example, most companies are doing something to develop opportunities for local businesses to become suppliers. And that's the orange portions of these bars. But only a handful of them, as shown by the gray bars, have taken steps to ensure that women entrepreneurs are being included in these support activities. And this last chart shows one of the lowest scoring indicators of the whole assessment, with only 3 companies showing up in 2020 and 4 in 2022. And this is simply asking if companies are regularly assessing the impacts of their activities on women in communities, whether as standalone gender impact assessments or as part of broader impact assessments. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing of the Canadian government's initiative on this issue, as it sounds very promising. So in a nutshell then, action on gender where it matters most is still the exception to the norm. There is certainly still plenty of scope for governments to introduce incentives, requirements, and guidelines to drive stronger action by companies on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you for letting us understand the full picture, including the gaps. And we will soon be talking about the Canadian example and the impact assessments, but I totally agree that this is a burning issue. And I think we can discuss why there is this hesitancy towards this very important need. But before getting there, we have been talking about gaps, but can you also tell us about the best practices, good practices that made a difference? Can you also tell us about the other side of this coin?
Well, sure. Yes. So, well, as you know, again, we look at, in our assessments, we look at the actions of companies, not governments. But we have taken notice of the positive impact that regulations can make on company performances. And we've seen that in quite a wide range of issues. On gender equality, I can mention 2 examples. Firstly, in South Africa, in relation to PPE for women workers, and second in Chile, in relation to working conditions conducive to the needs of women workers. So in South Africa, a 2013 revision of the Mine Health and Safety Act specified that protective equipment needs to be suitable. So this very small adjustment in the wording was made with the intent to cover the needs of women workers as well as men, but clearly by itself, it gave quite little for companies or even the regulators to work with. However, a few years later, the country's Mine and Health Safety Council issued detailed guidelines of the interpretation of this legal provision. And these guidelines outlined in practical terms how companies can ensure that PPE they provide to women workers is fit for purpose and safe for use. And at around the same time, the Department of Mineral Resources also published guidelines on the preparation of a mandatory code of practice for PPE for women workers, similarly outlining how companies can collaborate with women workers to assess the risks of wearing PPE that is inappropriate and to actually recommend changes to better fit their needs. In the RMI reports, we've seen the impact of this smart mix of legislation plus guidelines, as South African companies tend to be among the better performers on this issue. And they tend to show evidence of actual specific initiatives on PPE for women workers. However, we have seen two important shortcomings in terms of implementation of these policy instruments. First of all, from what we can see from publicly available data, implementation in South Africa seems to be patchy. Some companies certainly seem to be slower to react, and it's still not clear how systematically companies have put in practice these initiatives for gender-appropriate PPE. Second, South African companies with operations outside of the country have generally not shown evidence of implementing these same good practices in other jurisdictions, i.e., where relevant legislation may not be in place. And this issue of inconsistent practices across companies' portfolios is one we have seen on a whole range of issues. Then turning to the example of Chile, the national Chilean norm on gender equality and work-life balance was established by the government in 2012. So this norm is not a requirement per se, but rather a standard against which mining operations and indeed any businesses can be certified. It covers a wide spectrum of issues, including, for example, family-friendly work schedules, the prevention of gender-based violence, and the provision of breastfeeding rooms and breastfeeding breaks for women workers. In our RMI reports, the Chilean state-owned enterprise, Codelco, consistently scores relatively well on gender issues within its workforce because it does align its practices with this national standard. Now, I need to emphasize that we haven't looked further at the real end results of these policy instruments on the well-being of women workers in these countries. We have heard, for example, from a labor union in South Africa that there are still real issues for women workers trying to get appropriate PPE. But I think if there are positive lessons to be learned from these two examples, they do offer practical and rather detailed guidance and expectations for companies to follow. I think this operational aspect is really important, as it not only offers more chance for implementation, but also offers for better monitoring and tracking of compliance. Thank you, Eggy. Back to you.
Jennifer, thank you very much for this very clear picture. And I was thinking that when you mentioned of the government policies promoting corporate policies and vice versa, I think it's really important to understand in this webinar. I think this will be one of the end results that we will go towards through this webinar, because I think these policies go most of the time hand in hand. They're not in silo. So thank you very much for this great framing. And we'll go back to the corporate side of this equation very soon. But first, I want to go back and speak about public policies to continue framing the state of play. Most often companies, like you say, Jennifer, adapt to the legislative framework of the country in which they operate. And this is why when we did our report on policy options for governments, we grouped the first set of policy options under the category legislation. And when we speak about a gender-responsive mining policy framework, first and foremost, we highlight that mining codes and laws should not discriminate against women and should be inclusive of everyone. And I think when I say this, people think it's obvious and mining codes do not discriminate against women. But most of the time, not having progressive action brings together discrimination, especially in areas where inequality is deeply entrenched. We must not forget that there are often deep-seated cultural traits that limit women's opportunities with mining. In some cultures, for instance, it's deemed inappropriate for women to engage in certain types of mining, as outdated stereotypes suggest that only men can work in risky, dirty, and difficult environments, or in some cultures, female miners are seen as loose women. These barriers also manifest in many countries with a connotation that women cause a spirit of bad luck when in close proximity to mineral-bearing stones. And I recently learned the reason for this, the history behind this belief. It was thought that Mother Earth was a woman, so when there is another woman in its presence, that woman caused jealousy of the Mother Earth, and so Mother Earth didn't reveal its very precious stones. So although these kind of beliefs now seem to us ridiculous or funny, these excuses have long been used to justify banning women from pits. And in addition to the cultural traits, we know that International Labour Organization has had a convention in place since 1935, prohibiting the employment of women in underground mining work. While most of the countries that had initially ratified this convention back in 1930s, 1940s have since denounced it, and now these countries are now more likely to be signatories to the ILO's Convention 176, Safety and Health in Mines, that covers rights of all workers. There are still some countries where this outdated convention is in place. This means underground mining is legally prohibited for women in these countries. My bottom line here is not doing anything in a context that is already highly discriminatory feeds gender inequality. And this is why we need actions and policies aiming at tilting the balance in favor of women. To this end, when we were working on the policy options in our report, we included five important areas where governments could take a progressive action to change this equation. First recommendation was to include international human rights and gender equality standards in national laws regulating the mining sector. The second recommendation is create national action plans that address gender equality in the mining sector. Another one is to conduct gender analysis to integrate gender equality into mining policy frameworks. Another recommendation is to work with a gender team. And lastly, utilize tax incentives. All these policy options we listed in our report find their real value only when policymakers act on them. And today we're very lucky to host two of the very best examples, Canada and Colombia. We will start with Colombia, where they acted on several policy options, including but not limited to creating an action plan to increase women's participation in the formal mining workforce, collecting and analyzing gender segregated data, and working with a gender team. And today, one of the very important people in this gender team is with us. And I will now give the floor to Mari Paz Rodriguez Hermien, Gender Equality Lead of the Ministry of Mines and Energy of Colombia. But I just also want to remind you that Mari Paz will speak in Spanish. So if you haven't set your interpretation yet, please do this. In case you do not speak Spanish, please click the interpretation button and switch to the language that you prefer. Mari Paz, can you give us a snapshot of your policies for gender equality and women's empowerment in the mining sector? What are the flagship policies and programs that you're particularly proud of?
Thank you, Ege, and the IGF team for inviting us to this panel. It's a real honor to be here and to share with you and get to know some of the strategies aimed at the inclusion and the diversity in the energy and mining sector. I will go ahead and continue in Spanish. So, como sector, nosotros hemos desarrollado.
So as a sector, we have developed different actions during the last 2 years in order to be able to give orientation to inclusion and diversity. And our main roadmap has been guidelines for gender equality in the sector, which we launched in 2020 around March. And then a collaborative work where the Ministry of Mines and Energy participated, companies, subscribed entities, local entities, guilds, associations, enterprises, and also the civil society. As I was saying, this is our roadmap in order to promote all actions that are aiming to gender focus from community labor work. And this is an exercise on which we're feeling very proud of because it's not only an unprecedented exercise, it's nationwide. There are another projects that have developed a roadmap in this sense, but we have also been a reference for the region in gender approach in a sector that has been so masculinized as it is the mining energy sector. Specifically, guidelines, we divided them in four axes. The first one has to do with all the engagement of women in direct and indirect employment, decision-making positions, and the value chain in the sector. Also, we have a second axis that has to do with culture for gender equality, which is all this exercise also because all gender issues require a cultural change, a cultural mindset in the core of business, in the way we do business, in the way our organizations are developed from private enterprises as well as of our public entities, as it is the case of Ministry of Mines and Energy that I represent. It also, the whole articulation of the constitutional order have to be included, and as well as cross-sectorial. And we have a point in which I believe it is where we require most progress on in a decided way, which has to do with prevention and reduction of violence against women in the industry and on communities in the areas of influence in our projects. And the way we build them, we consider that these guidelines are around specific benefits for our sector, from which I just want to mention the most important ones because of the sake of time. First, we're unifying criteria so that the entities in the sector can integrate, incorporate this gender focus in everything that has to do with their policies, plans, and projects. The Ministry of Mine and Energy has 7 entities subscribed to which we are also given a guideline or any help and assistance. We're also guiding companies to take into account certain gender issues to develop this inclusion gender or gender inclusion policies. And we also have a line that's allowing us to promote initiatives that require an effective implementation of gender focus, gender approach in work spots. And the last thing is that they promote articulated actions with local developments, which at the same time allow to mitigate different social impacts in our management. Now, in the last 2 years of the guidelines implementation, we've had important progress because the Ministry of Mine and Energy is playing a double role, and it is we are a policy governing agency in the sector, but besides, but when we're a governing entity, we have to give guidelines for our subscribed entities, for companies in general, and for the whole sector. But besides, we have to do a management inside of the organization as such. So we've had important progress in different axes in what has to do with the internal management of the ministry, in what we've done with our ally entities, our subscribed entities, and what we have with our companies. I would like to start with what we're doing with enterprises, with companies. We made a partnership for gender equality, which is called Transforming Energy. And I think it is a very interesting exercise because as national government, we cannot do anything if we don't have the commitment of our companies that we've understood that they are our branches in the territory. They're the ones who get to the territories. And this partnership, we have it made up by more than 34 companies or enterprises. The 3 subsectors participate, which are power, mining, and hydrocarbon. Also, guilds participate and women organizations. And basically what we're seeking is to have a knowledge management community with the purpose of working in plans to achieve equal opportunities for men and women. I think that has been the core point of what we've done with companies, enterprises. And in the frame of this exercise, we could gather interesting information regarding how women's participation is in the sector, because really one of the main challenges and is that we didn't have any challenges related to the situation of women. And I think that's an essential point. And later on, I'll talk to you about the sectorial study, but this exercise with the companies have helped us in a very meaningful way because we can also leverage companies that are in very preliminary stages in gender matters with the experience of other companies that probably are more advanced, especially in the power sector. And from the ministry, how is it that we've done it? The first thing is that we already created a gender issues committee or board, which formulates an action plan for all our entities and supports its implementation. And the Ministry of Mine and Energy, besides, is the first entity, the public entity, that has attached itself to Equipares seal, which is a seal for gender equality, which is led by our Ministry of Work. And that's how we've designed a roadmap in that matrix. And among other actions, we've also designed a set of pedagogic tools in order to promote gender approach in a transversal way in everything that has to do with the design of policies, programs, and sector initiatives. And one of the last actions that we've carried out, as I said, this is a general snapshot of what we're carrying out. It is that with the support of a World Bank, we designed a strategy, a diagnosis, and a guideline to include gender focus in our planning cycles, and that way to be able to get the resources available from our general budget of the nation. These efforts have allowed us to advance in compliance of a roadmap traced of guidelines, and no doubt there is a very long way to go in such a way that gender equality and inclusion are an essential axis of what we do as a sector, that it is a strategy that is in our business core, that is not minor issues, and that gender equality and progress in gender equality ends up being a good business for our sector. Thank you very much.
Maripaz, this was very rich. And I think there are too many things to unpack and continue talking about. And I think we will have more and more questions about these practices because there were too many good practices that you mentioned in one presentation, one intervention. But there is something that you said, and I found it very impressive. And I just want to highlight, you said that as a government, you see the industry as your branches in the field. And I think it's really important because without the support and cooperation of the industry, governments may not be able to drive change. So I think it's really important that you recognize this partnership in this very multifaceted way. And I also want to ask you a follow-up question about how do you promote this? How do you promote this partnership? How do you make sure that there is this good relationship with the industry and you can continue working together? And I think what I understand from your intervention, you make the use of gender disaggregated data, you recognize the best practices, and you also help them learn from your experiences and your knowledge. So you also help them understand the global trends, like what you did with the sectorial study. You help them understand the best tools to apply. So can you just give us more information about how
davantage d'informations? Oui.
Sorry?
Pardon?
There was interpretation went off. It's back now.
Okay. Okay. On to you, Maripaz. Can you tell us how do you make sure that this partnership and collaboration goes on?
Claro que sí. Realmente, sin las empresas no podríamos adelantar nada.
Of course, really, without the companies, we couldn't advance in anything. And there are 2 points I would like to talk about. The first one is collection of information, understanding that data are necessary to progress in the decision making. We cannot progress in decision making without data, as we have done it so far. And the other thing is to generate a knowledge management culture or mindset that allows us to implement initiatives that have been already formulated in other contexts, because really companies from our sectors are facing similar challenges, and by knowing what's being done from other organizations can progress in a better way. So it's just 2 points I want to talk about. The first thing is that one of the main challenges that we found as sector at the moment of formulating guidelines that, as I said, has been really with the support of the international cooperation. Hadn't it been because of the international cooperation, probably we wouldn't have been able to get it, to make it, because the human team in charge of these issues in the ministry is really small, with all the decision, with all the desire of continued progress, but still very small. So with the support of international cooperation, we identified that we did not have a baseline in the industry that could show us the landscape of women participation in the labor market, which is an important point, as well as in the participation of women in the community environment. Because let's remember the essential impact that the sector has in the country regions and in a country of some conditions as Colombia. So with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank in an advisory that we had, we did a sectorial study, which I believe that it is also an interesting input so that other countries can also adopt it and adapt it to its conditions. In this sectorial study, more than 70 companies from the sector participated, as I said, from the subsectors from mining, energy, and hydrocarbons, helped us identify some figures to be able to identify gaps in the labor market and good practices in terms of gender equality. This sectorial study allowed us to identify, for instance, key information of the 70 companies. For instance, what is the participation of women in the total employment? We found that the mining sector is the energy sector is the one that's advancing the most, but the whole sector still participation of women still below the national average. Participation of women right now is in 27% for the mine and energy sector, when in the national arena is around 39 or 40% of participation. In the energy sector, we have the most meaningful advances, which are of 33% of participation of women. In the hydrocarbon sector is of 28%, and in the one of mining is of 20%. And especially in mining, there's an explanation, and it is that still in this country, there are situations as the one that Egis mentioned at the beginning, and it is that it is considered that it is a bad luck that a woman enters a coal mine. It doesn't make any sense, but it happens. And for instance, that still we have a lot of mining that they have in some contexts called informal or subsistence mining, and in that sense women end up being the most affected ones, and that's where that gap between men and women is comes up. And we could analyze the makeup by levels, for instance, that the higher the hierarchy, the lower amount of women, the lower quantity of women or number of women. And in commitment by gender equality, we found that all companies believe that it is interesting, although only 12% have a gender equality policy. So that's why it is important to have spaces as the partnership that I was mentioning, because finally we can build together on where we want to go towards. And that has been like our main input to design a set of actions to be able to advance in gender equality. Study also revealed, I believe I'm a few minutes away, but I just want to take an additional minute to tell you that it revealed, for instance, that there is an absence of gender approach in the procurement process for suppliers, for vendors. We don't have a gender or approach in the supply chain, but there are good practices, for instance, in safe environments, free of violence, the support to breastfeeding, above the legal recommendations, etc. In this line of knowledge management, we have a program that's called Meaningful Experiences, where what we do is to identify good practices that point to achievement of sustainable development goals, several of them, but we always prioritize the SDG 5, which is gender equality, and we always systematize those good practices or document them to put them in paper so that others can do the search and to apply it in other contexts or that query. And right now we have a web portal in the Ministry of Mine and Energy where we can do all the consultation of good practices.
Thank you very much, Monica. Maybe you can also paste the link for this report
For sure.
and also for the in the chat box.
Muy bien,
I just want to say
Maripaz.
a few words about data.
Thank
I think it's extremely important what you have just said. Without data, without gender segregated and properly collected data, we cannot design the policies. And I think it also relates to our next speaker, but I just want to say that this study that you mentioned of is of critical importance because you use women's empowerment principles that are spearheaded jointly by UN Women and Global Compact as your benchmark. And I think it's really important because then these companies also become signatories to women's empowerment principles, and they commit themselves to collect and monitor gender segregated data in certain intervals. So to me, this is not just a study that shows the current state of play, but it's a forward-looking study that helps us, helps companies plan for their future steps. So I think it's really important. And just related to data, I also wanted to announce here that IGF, in partnership with International Labour Organization, also with the Environmental Governance Program jointly implemented by UNDP and Swedish Environmental Agency, and with International Women in Mining, is now launching a project on data. Actually, the ultimate goal of the project is to understand how low carbon transition and new technologies in the mining sector will have an impact on the employment of women in the future of mine. But the first step, like you said, Maripaz, in your presentation, which is very important, will be to collect data to understand the current state of play, the skills, employment, occupations, and needs of women, so that we can plan ahead. So I just wanted to tease about this project when you mentioned of data. And well, here I will give the floor to another good government practice, this time from Canada. And this also relates to data. While Canada has a number of best practices in terms of integrating gender equality in the governance of natural resources, there is a unique success that is very important to highlight. And it is related to integrating gender into the impact assessment process before project development. When IGF has developed the policy options, we focused on impact assessments as a standalone topic, as this aspect is mostly missed out when government policies are designed and implemented. And also, as Jennifer pointed out, this also happens with the industry. Impact assessments are mostly missed out when corporate policies are designed and implemented. It's very important to analyze how mining projects will impact men and women differently before the permit process. Accordingly, environmental and social impact assessment regulations and legislation should identify how mining operations impact on women's empowerment and gender roles will be assessed and analyzed by the industry. Well, as Jennifer also mentioned, there are different ways of doing this, like standalone gender impact assessments or an integrated approach to include gender into environmental and social impact assessments. But one important thing to underline here is that a thorough gender mapping process should include an intersectional lens and should be able to shed light on how different groups, such as women with disabilities, women belonging to ethnic minorities, or indigenous women, will be affected by mining operations differently. And before listening to a very successful government regulation in this regard, let me say a few words about why it is so important to assess the gendered impacts of mining operations before project development. Let's start with governments. For governments, this is a tool to ensure that mining operations are carried out with respect to the human rights treaties and frameworks to which states are party. Governments can also use gender analysis to ensure that women's and men's rights are equally respected throughout the entire operation cycle of mining projects in the country. And last, gender impact assessments or similar tools help governments hold mining companies accountable for their progress in engaging women in mining operations. And why this is so important for companies? First of all, assessing gendered impacts of mining would ensure compliance with international human rights standards and due diligence requirements. Secondly, this is a tool to better understand the potential impacts of their operations so that they can develop plans to avoid or mitigate any negative impacts. Companies can also use the findings of these assessments to inform the design of their community development projects that address women's needs and requirements. And lastly, and very importantly, addressing the gendered impacts of mining at the outset of project development is critical to gain and maintain a social license to operate. that otherwise can result in conflict and costly shutdowns, as we have seen globally. And for the civil society, assessing gendered impacts of mining before project development is important, as this would offer them a baseline for monitoring the impact of mining operations, which is an imperative tool for effective advocacy in demand for equal treatment for women. However, despite all these benefits, and as RMF also pointed out in their Responsible Mining Index, the good practice in this particular domain is very little, if none. And reasons are many. I think we can discuss the reasons during Q&A, but the result is the same. Gender impact assessments are scarcely conducted in the mining sector. The government of Canada, on the other hand, breaks the cycle by the introduction of Gender-Based Analysis Plus, GBA Plus, which is an analytical tool to assess how women, men, and gender diverse people may experience policies, programs, and initiatives differently. I now give the floor to our speaker from Natural Resources Canada, Mr. Hermien, to learn more about how they apply the Gender-Based Analysis Plus in the management of natural resources of Canada. Min, can you tell us about what Gender-Based Analysis Plus is and how NRCON applies the Gender-Based Analysis Plus in the management of natural resources?
So thank you, Ege. Hello, bonjour, everyone. My name is Min, and I work at Natural Resources Canada. I'd first like to start by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking from is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to present in this territory. So I'll start with that. And so I want to give a quick shout out to my team, Melissa Ryan, who helped me with part of the presentation today. She is our GBA Plus expert. So just want to recognize her contributions. She's very knowledgeable about the topic. And I also wish that we had some friends from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and also the Department of Women and Gender Equality. The GBA Plus is a very big endeavor across the departments. There are many folks working on this, very integrated into our thinking. So thank you, Agri, for inviting us, inviting me to participate in this panel. So as you know, gender equality is enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is part of the Constitution of Canada. So something very at the heart of Canadians. And the government of Canada has been committed to using Gender-Based Analysis Plus in the development of policies, programs, and legislation since 1995. So something that's been happening for a very long time. And GBA Plus is, as you mentioned, an analytical process that provides a very rigorous method for the assessment of systemic inequalities, as well as a means to assess how diverse groups of women, men, and gender diverse people may experience policies, programs, and initiatives. So the plus acknowledges that we all have multiple characteristics that intersect and contribute to who we are, like race, ethnicity, religion, age, and mental or physical disability, and how the interaction between these factors influences the way we might experience government policies and initiatives. So at Natural Resources Canada, GBA Plus is integrated into all our decision-making processes, but requiring one for every single budget proposal, memorandum to cabinet, and Treasury Board submission. And so we have to assess the potential implications of all the policies and programs on diverse populations of Canadians. And one of these is the Impact Assessment Act. And federal project assessments also require a GBA Plus analysis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat and send the link here to everybody. So the link here is from the Impact Assessment Agency, and it's the guidance on GBA Plus. So you can read about it, get a little bit of more of the history and how it's used, some of the guidance. It is still very new for us to implement. So we're kind of learning, growing, going through some of the pains at the same time, but really understanding the importance of it and how that the impact assessment process includes gender-based plus analysis. A lot of this also informs our thinking on new programs on gender. So I'll give you a few examples. So in addition to, say, the Impact Assessment Act, Natural Resources Canada has also implemented a number of different initiatives related to gender. So there's the NRCan-led Equal by 30 campaign, which asks companies and governments to ensure equal pay, opportunity, and leadership for women by 2030 as we transition to a clean energy future. And so far, it has recruited over 130 signatories from the public and private sector. Our Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan has established an aspirational target to increase the representation of women in the mining industry's workforce to 30% by 2030. A different program on Cleantech, so the Women in Cleantech Challenge, supports 6 globally significant clean technology companies founded and run by 6 women. And at the end of the challenge, one will receive $1 million to continue building their business. So you can see that there's a variety of things that we've learned and built in and developed that's very targeted. And of course, there's the Diversity in STEM Reentry Program, also known as STEM the Gap. So at NRCan, we strive to redress imbalances in gender and Indigenous representation by enabling women and Indigenous peoples who hold a degree in science, technology, engineering, and math to re-enter the workforce following an absence of 5 years or more. So very important to recognize, there are gaps in employment and economic participation. I also want to speak about industry. So Canada's mining industry has also undertaken steps to address issues of discrimination, harassment, and violence at mine sites while improving outcomes for underrepresented groups. So the example that is well known is the Mining Association of Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining, TSM standard. And it's a globally recognized sustainability program that supports mining companies in managing key environmental and social risks. TSM was the first mining sustainability standard in the world to require site-level assessments and is mandatory for all companies that are members of implementing associations. And additionally, through TSM, the industry is implementing a newly updated standard on Indigenous and community relationships that includes ensuring management and employees at mine sites are educated on the history of Indigenous peoples and receive skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. And this is really important for us because a lot of mining happens in the northern parts of Canada with a number of Indigenous workers. And so if I remember my stats correctly, I believe there's about 16,500 Indigenous workers in the mining sector for Canada, which is one of the largest among the natural resource sectors. So kind of looking ahead, we're building on our foundation of GBA Plus and looking to see how we can approach this, not just in really understanding how it works in the regulatory process, but also in our approach to broadening it to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the mining sector. So we're kind of moving into this world where we're broadening our thoughts and building from GBA Plus. There is still a lot of work to do to address equality, systemic barriers, and of course, gender-based violence in all sectors. And of course, as you mentioned, Ege, it's very difficult because the data is not quite there. We're always looking for disaggregated data. And we do have case studies, but it's very difficult because a case study tells you very specific things going on, tells you something very specific, and then you have to think about, well, how does it apply across the sector, right? And what are the types of interventions industry or government would like to pursue? So it's a very interesting moment for us. At the same time, Canada's mining sector is facing an increasing skills gap and labor shortages, which could impact the sector's ability to remain competitive. So governments, industry, and stakeholders are responding through actions to pursue gender equality, to increase the number of women and visible minorities in the mining sector, and to advance Indigenous participation. So it's a time where we're using all of this information we do have to kind of see where do we go looking forward. So with that, I'm happy to answer your questions today. Thank you so much for inviting us to this panel. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Ege.
Well, I think your intervention was perfectly showing us the double side of this equation, like I was trying to frame at the outset. Like governments can have a regulatory role, like the one that you have been doing with the Impact Assessments Act, but governments should also invest in gender equality themselves in the mining sector. And these programs for skills gap that you mentioned of, like STEM the Gap, for example, these are also perfect examples of how governments can invest in gender equality in the sector. And thank you for giving us the full snapshot of how this can be done by a government. But I want to go back to the impact assessments, because I think Canadian example is particularly important in the sense that there is not only a legislation, which is great because I think there are not so many legislations globally that are regulating the integration of gender into impact assessments. There is the legislation, But in addition to the legislation, you also provide a usable toolkit. So I think this is really important. And here, Maria from Oxfam is also pasting this important link in the chat box. I wanted to draw attention to this. But yes, I wanted to learn from your experience, what are the key challenges in implementation when it comes to integrating gender into impact assessments? Is it about willingness of the private sector, or is there lack of expertise, or is there any hesitancy from the local communities to engage? What are the key barriers that you have determined after years of experience in the sector, in the field, trying to integrate gender into impact assessments?
Yeah, so I think some of the challenges we have, one is data, so not having the disaggregated data. So what the GBA Plus will ask us, what is your baseline? So if you don't have that information, it's very difficult to then say, how do you incent change? How do you do the change? So that's one beginning. I think the second one is just an understanding of how to engage on a meaningful conversation, and making sure that there are adequate resources, either from the proponent side, the community side, to participate. So when you look at it, it's not just talking about engaging community, but also maybe finding ways to engage specific parts of the community so that you can understand much more specifically what are the challenges there, and then also understanding what is the ways you want to mitigate against that. So I think what has been very challenging is that in the impact assessment world, we've been so used to doing environmental impacts. So we talk about pollution, we talk about remediation, we talk about GHGs now, but now there's a sense that we really want to have that conversation about the social impacts, the socioeconomic impacts. And that's a bit harder. I think finding the expertise in the community is probably very challenging as well. The second part is champions. You need to have champions to want to come and engage government and to kind of represent that perspective. So there are examples from the industry doing that, but I think there's a need to kind of have more expertise and to find more resources to kind of hear the voices and bring that perspective. I think it's challenging because I know the mining workforce is only, I think it's for women, it's 14%. So it's still very low. And that's why we want to increase it. But, we want to understand the challenges and how industry can deal with difficult, things like gender-based violence, which, if someone speaks up about it, it's very difficult because you need the entire industry to kind of step up and, be there, have a really frank conversation about it and talk about ways they want to mitigate it. But if there's only one or two companies coming out and talking about it, they're kind of, on their own and looking very negative compared to everyone else. So there's the stigma of that as well. So many different challenges, very cultural challenge on that side, the data as well. But I think on the flip side, it's government coming in and providing incentives and helping kind of push the envelope on the conversation and saying, let's work towards certain goals that are common and then find the ways to kind of support each other on getting to where we want to go.
Thank you so much. I think it's extremely important what you have just said. If there are only a couple of companies trying to bring up the issues of gender-based violence, for example, then these companies may seem like the source of the problem, not the contributors for the solution. So I think it's really important to have that we have a common ground, we have a common voice to speak about these issues, because otherwise, like you said, the image will be just the opposite of what the truth is. So I think it's really important what you have just shared with us. Thank you very much for this. And well, before moving to the private sector, I want to mention of a very comprehensive study that had been undertaken by the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI, in partnership with the World Resources Institute. This study examines how natural resource governance laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines in 12 resource-rich countries characterize women and gender and consider their potential to bring about transformative change to achieve gender equality. And I will now give the floor to Ms. Aubrey Menard to learn more about their findings. Aubrey, can you tell us about the main highlights of your report?
Thanks, Aggie. Thanks for having me today. I'd be very happy to tell you about this report. So laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines are the mechanisms through which governments transform political priorities, principles, commitments into actions and requirements. And so we already saw earlier from Jennifer's great example of PPE in South Africa, how governments can articulate these sort of priorities in a way that and change guidelines in a way that can actually save women's lives and can do so much to advance gender equality. And so when we were doing this research, Liz and I set about to answer the question of where and how governments are speaking about women and gender in the extractive sector, as well as to learn about their views on women and gender minorities' inclusion in policymaking. So understanding the mechanisms through which countries are currently attempting to address the gender differentiated impacts of the sector is critical to the effort of drafting better commitments that are more likely to create gender transformative change. Our research specifically focused on the laws, policies, regulations, and guidelines in 12 countries, which were Argentina, Canada, Colombia, Ghana, Indonesia, Kenya, Mongolia, Morocco, Nigeria, Peru, Sierra Leone, and Tunisia. In these 12 countries, we identified a total of 30 documents that were directly relevant to the extractive sector in that they specifically govern the sector. So for example, national oil or mining laws, and that also mentioned women, gender, or sex. We found that governments most commonly mention women, gender, or sex in their laws as compared to policies, regulations, guidelines, or other documents, and that the majority of these laws that we found addressed women in two primary ways. So firstly, they established governing bodies to oversee the extractive sector functions and included simple quotas requiring women's participation on governing boards. Most commonly, the quotas required only the participation of 1 or 2 women, which in all cases constituted less than 22% of the governing board. The other major trend in these laws were that they prohibited women from working underground on mining sites, which you already talked about. And so actually these laws date back initially to a British law from 1842 that spread first due to colonialism, and then, as you mentioned, later through the interventions of the ILO. In terms of what the documents actually aim to do, we found that these documents can be generally placed into 3 categories: those that enable women's participation, those that call for disaggregating data by gender, and those which create transparency measures. In terms of women's participation, some of the documents that we reviewed required the participation of individual women, and to a lesser extent required the participation of organizations representing women. As I've already mentioned, some documents introduced quotas for women's participation. Other documents aim to create broad changes to the culture around women's participation, like some of the Canadian examples that we've heard about today. And other documents, there were quotas around women's participation or aimed to change culture, but some of them often lacked firm requirements or specific mechanisms for doing so. So some countries aim to increase women's benefits from the sector directly through value and job creation, as we were talking about with the Canadian example. Secondly, some documents focused on data disaggregation by gender. And as we heard earlier from Maria Paz, the collection of data is extremely important to women and gender minorities in the sector, so we can actually know and see what's happening and use this data to transform things. Despite broad recognition that gender disaggregated data is important, both to developing effective interventions and assessing the impact of legal and policy frameworks, little disaggregated data about the sector gendered effects actually exists. So within our sample of 30 documents, few require the government or companies to collect gender disaggregated data for the extractive sector. Only 6 of the documents that we found made any reference to gender disaggregated data, and those came from Colombia, Peru, and Mongolia. However, these few documents that require gender disaggregated data largely understood gender to be nothing more than the binary of women and men. So consequently, even in the case that gender disaggregated data is collected, gender minorities will be excluded or miscounted in data that will be used to inform policy and decision making. And this has the effect of compounding the invisibility of gender and sexual minorities and obfuscating issues that impact them. Conversely, creating visibility through data collection and disaggregation can contribute to reducing stigma and facilitate additional data collection and research, as well as advance policies in the development of services to address the needs of gender minority and gender diverse populations. And finally, some documents focused on transparency measures. Open, transparent government in which citizens are able to access and understand data can create more equal participation, accountability, responsive governance, service delivery, and gender sustainability outcomes. Transparency and data accessibility can help ensure that governments are responsive to the diverse and gendered needs of all their citizens. However, most of the documents that we found did not explicitly require transparency in relation to their specific gender provisions. But fortunately, this is something that we're seeing recently in the EITI standard has expanded to include gender requirements, and more countries are joining. And so we look forward to the fusion of transparency and gender issues. So I'll turn that back over to you, Eggy, and happy to answer any follow-up questions that you have.
I feel like we definitely need another webinar for the data question, because there is so much to unpack, and it relates to governments, how to collect the data, it relates to industry, how to collect the data in the field, etc. So I really want to leave this question open. Maybe we can attend to this question during Q&A, but definitely it's clear that we need another webinar just to focus on the data question. But yes, Aubrey, I understand that this research was a diligent and unprecedented process that included a thorough literature review, stakeholder consultations, and also data verification. And after such a detailed exercise, if I asked you to pick one key recommendation for governments, and then one for the industry and one for the civil society, what would these three recommendations be?
Well, thank you so much for your kind words about our research. Liz just dropped the link into the chat box if anyone wants to have a look at the actual report. We developed detailed recommendations based on the research, and I encourage you all to take a look at the report for the full set of recommendations. But if I had to focus on one in particular, I'd say it's our recommendation that commitments should be ambitious. Many of the documents that we reviewed contain gender provisions that were unambitious. So for example, the simple quota requirements that I mentioned that Ghana's documents contain, they required just a woman or two to be included on a single board. Even if well implemented, this sort of requirement will do little to transform gender relations in a country's extractive sector or beyond. So these quotas provide for nominal women's representation in governing bodies. However, provisions often do not require that women appointed to these positions have any particular qualifications or have historically represented women's interests in any demonstrable way. And so this is a little bit tricky, because while overly rigorous requirements could be used to justify the exclusion of women from these positions, with no requirements stated, it's also possible that women may be appointed or chosen to fill these quotas specifically because they're likely to be compliant with dominant cultures. Research shows that in order to affect gender transformative change, there needs to be a critical mass of women, which is defined generally at more than 1/3 in leadership positions. Otherwise, women are stereotyped, tokenized, they're easily overshadowed and dismissed. So it is not until this critical threshold is reached that perceptions begin to shift and fundamental change begins to occur. So if documents are using quotas to require the presence of women and gender minorities, they should do so in significant amounts, not only on the governing boards of organizations, but through the entire governance structure and supply chain in order for gender transformative change to occur. And beyond creating quotas for the participation of women and gender minorities, documents should be ambitious about creating systemic change. So for example, documents can be designed to require transparency on benefit impact agreements, promote the collection and transparency of data on local procurement and employment, and even to build interventions to deal specifically with the gender differentiated impacts prevalent in extraction affected communities, which we've heard about from some of the other speakers today. And more than having ambitious goals for women and gender minorities participation, documents should also be bold in the type of change which they aim to create. From shifting culture in the extractive industries to changing the way decision-making occurs in extractive affected communities, to realigning economic power. Reform of the extractive sector has the potential to drastically impact the lives of people in affected communities and countries. And as such, in creating documents, governments should carefully consider what the desired and likely impacts of the documents may be and creating ambitious gender transformative change.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. So my bottom line is these policies should be ambitious enough for a transformative change to happen. And thank you very much for this important highlight. Before going to my last panelist, I just want to say that I am trying to monitor the chat in the chat box. And Joanne, I have taken note of your comment about data collected in ASM being kind of a precedent in terms of showing us how we can improve data collection in LSM. And I really hope that we have time for this question during the Q&A. I just wanted to acknowledge that I am trying to keep an eye in the chat box. Okay, so let's switch back to the other side of this equation, which is the private sector. And today we have a very important panelist, Ms. Hermien, Head of Sustainability Engagement of Anglo American, and she will tell us about the perspective on corporate regulations and challenges in addressing gender issues across all jurisdictions. Hermien, Anglo American has one of the best records when it comes to ESG, including gender equality. And can you give us a quick snapshot of your main focuses in South Africa in terms of gender equality? Do you have specific corporate policies for employment, local content, community development that put gender equality in their focus?
Well, first, thank you again, Jennifer, for having me. It's a privilege to be here. It is equally a privilege to be able to talk about good practices. And I say so with full acknowledgement that, Jennifer, when you were talking about some of the gaps that companies have in the RMI report, a lot of them felt very true for Anglo American too. But that's not, that doesn't diminish the fact that I think that we're on a very important journey. Just to give people on the call a little bit of context, Anglo American is a diversified mining company listed both in Johannesburg and London. We've got nearly 100,000 employees, 24% of which are female at present. 2007, which is about when I joined, that was only 10%. So it's been quite a steep increase over those few years. We have a target of 25% of our board being female. As it stands now, we actually have 5 female non-executive directors and 4 male. So we have more women currently, and in our South African executive team, we have only 1 man and 3 women who are the leaders of our business units there. If you had told me that would be the case a few years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. So I'm proud of where we are. But men, as you were talking about earlier on, we've got other things that we have to confront, like gender-based violence, which are a reality for us as they are for every other mining company generally, I would argue. So what I'm going to do is just give you a feel for how we see these things at Anglo American and how we're approaching it, with a little bit of an example here or there where I think it's something that we've done uniquely or something that's maybe interesting to the people on the call today. First, I should say that we talk about inclusion and diversity, and gender is one of the many aspects of inclusion and diversity. It has its different dynamics, but sometimes I talk interchangeably, so forgive me for maybe swapping between the two. The way in which we see inclusion and diversity is within the different spheres of an employee's life. We don't believe that we can make a systemic and sustainable difference if we tackle IND only at work or only within the community spaces. We feel that we need to tackle it at work, within the schools around mining operations, within employee homes, which is something that we've done with safety and HIV as well. It's not unique to this issue. And then within the communities at large. When it comes to how we address the issue in the workplace, there is, and there's been a lot of conversation here about how much of it is local, how much of it is global, how much of it is related to legislation. Where we start is with our purpose and values. Everything has to be driven by that, but taking into account local legislation and context. Those aren't necessarily the same things. But as a global company, keeping our eye on international conventions, what happens at the ILO Convention 190 as an example. and acknowledging that we cannot purely operate on a local level. We need to make sure that we take into consideration international best practice. So from a workplace point of view, we have 4 different priorities on INB, and that is about inclusive leaders, about workplaces that are adaptable, fair, and supportive to people, a workplace where employees are valued and respected for who they are, and workplaces that are safe. Within that, we've done unconscious bias training with the top 100 leaders in our business, and then gradually moved to inclusive leadership training for every single leader in our business, which amounts to a few thousand actually. When it comes to an adaptable and a fair working environment, it's about family-friendly policies. When it comes to people being able to bring their whole selves to work, we've got employee networks throughout the business where people of different abilities, of sexual orientations, all different dimensions of diversity can express their needs and concerns and then bring them into the business. And then finally, on the safe and effective enabling environment, our focus there is on bullying, harassment, and victimization, where every employee is trained on what the expectations are in that respect. But let me pause a little bit there quickly because it speaks to the issue of data, which has been coming up quite a bit. When we started our work on gender-based violence, we found that a lot of the conversation revolved around speculation and rumor and perception. So what we did is conducted 2 baseline studies at some of our South African operations to understand the real dynamics, so that we could, in a technical mining environment, go to our leaders with evidence and say, this is what is happening on the ground. It's not a rumor, it's not speculation, this is what people are telling us. And on the basis of hard, quantitative and qualitative data, be able to start making changes to the business. What's interestingly happened subsequently is a trend for, it can sound callous and I don't want it to come across that way, but given that we're such a data-focused industry, a lot of our businesses now are monitoring and reporting cases of harassment as they would cases of safety incidents. One of our businesses, for example, has sexual harassment and bullying, harassment and victimization generally as an agenda item on every single management meeting, and cases are reported and monitored at that level. And I think that that's made a really big difference, especially since they acknowledge that these aren't figures that are going to be going down anytime soon. In fact, we know we're doing the right things if we see in the short term more cases being reported and eventually those trending downwards. But moving a little bit beyond the workplace, domestic violence has become a really important topic for us. I think internationally with COVID-19 and lockdown measures, it's really come to the attention of people who might not have realized the extent of the problem before. And in that regard, we've launched a new policy and support framework, which includes everything from paid leave to financial assistance to risk assessment support, Anglo-American provided housing in cases where people need to immediately get out of the situation that they're in, as well as counseling, with quite comprehensive training for, of course, the HR professionals in the business that need to deal with that. The blurred lines that we have now between the home and work environment have made this even more important because the majority of our corporate offices, as I am, are still working from home. The next sphere that we look at is schooling environments. We support 110, for example, schools in South Africa through whole schools interventions. And the moment we started our work on gender-based violence, but then also just shifting gender norms in communities, we saw this as the most amazing opportunity to plug gender issues into the work that we're already doing with schools in this regard, and we'll start to do with early childhood development centers shortly. Finally, in the community space, in my mind, I kind of split what we do into a standards-based approach and then actual programmatic interventions. And a lot of it is about integration too. The impact assessment conversation that was happening earlier on, we take a human rights approach to our community engagement and development work. That means that we have increased our focus on vulnerability in what we call our social way, which is the standard that dictates how we manage all of this. And what we've done differently in the current iteration of that is broken down vulnerable groups and what vulnerability means. So we don't have this block category of women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly, indigenous peoples. We treat every group as a potential vulnerable group and have guidance that helps people understand the situations in which vulnerability can be triggered and how to mitigate that vulnerability in the way that we engage and we do development work. Some of the more progressive things that we're looking at is applying gender lenses to things like our biodiversity standard, acknowledging that even though you might not immediately think so, things that we do in biodiversity support sustainable livelihoods and support ultimately women and girl children who, for example, have to go and fetch firewood instead of going to school. The second part, as I spoke about, is about programmatic interventions. And we have a sustainable mining plan. One of the three major pillars there is about thriving communities. And in that we look at sustainable livelihoods, we look at education, and we look at health. And acknowledging that we're getting very close to the end of our time together, I'm not going to go into any detail, but what we've done is unpicked the work that we do in all of those spaces to understand, first of all, to make sure that we're not doing harm in our existing interventions, but to look for just practical opportunities to improve gender outcomes through work that we're already doing. A quick example there is that we have a community-oriented primary care health program, which involves healthcare workers going into communities and providing services there. At the onset of COVID and the lockdown measures, we saw that as an opportunity to get information about support for people going through domestic violence into communities directly when they weren't coming into work anymore, to identify potential cases and support people within their home environments to address what they were going through. So I'm going to leave it there and just say thanks again for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you very much. I really want to be able to answer at least one or two of the questions that we received from the participants. But Hermien, can I ask you one last question? If you could give me a very concrete, short answer for this. Sorry for the time, but I really want to know if corporate policies change across different jurisdictions that the company operates in. For example, when we go to another country, do we see similar corporate policies? And of course, this question is related to how do national and local public policies impact your corporate policies?
Yes, absolutely, they do change. And that's why it's so important for us to always go back to our corporate purpose and values in how we approach things. A quick example is in South Africa, where race reporting is very common. In fact, it's a legal requirement. We need to understand male, female, and then different dimensions of race, whereas in other countries, it's illegal to ask people those things. So we have to do that all on a voluntary basis. So we have to manage that complexity, absolutely, of different contexts and legislative requirements. On the upside, though, we have the opportunity to share a lot of experience, information between businesses in different countries. So when it comes to diversity, our Chilean colleagues, for example, can pick up the phone to our South African colleagues and say, okay, well, you've been reporting on race for well over a decade now. Give us your insights. How can that work in our context? So yes, they are different, but there are definitely opportunities in those differences.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we don't have much time for the questions, actually. We're coming to the end, but there is one question that I want to pose to our panelists, and please feel free to answer. And one of the questions I want to take myself, because it relates to our work. But I just wanted to ask about the linkages with ASM. how do you think ASM policies would fit into this equation? Do governments also have progressive ASM policies in terms of gender equality? And related to this, is there a way that the data that we collect from ASM can also feed into our way of data collection in LSM? So I try to combine two questions, that one from the chat box and the other one from the Q&A box. And is there anyone who wants to answer this question about linkages between ASM and LSM and policies on ASM? Any of my panelists? If not, it means that we need more focus on ASM, that's for sure. But Jennifer, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to respond because I saw the question on what there was certain data collection of gender issues at ASM that could be particularly lessons learned for LSM. That I wasn't aware of, but there was a question of who is doing this. So I think from what we've seen, there was little evidence, at least nothing that I have seen, of large-scale mining companies engaging with ASM operations on this particular issue on gender. They engage on different issues, but not that I've seen on the gender issue. But I do know there is plenty of action going on in terms of civil society groups. And I know, for example, of the Sofedi group in DRC that's doing a lot of work on gender-based violence in ASM operations. So I think most of what we're going to find, it comes from civil society groups themselves.
Just adding to this, as we have just launched a project about data, gender segregated data in the mining sector, what I could say is that also the methods and tools to collect data varies between ASM and LSM. So the data that we collect from ASM may not speak to the data that we collect from LSM, but I totally agree that Actually, I think this was one of the points made by Min, that we have case studies, lots of case studies, but we do not have a broad scale data program that can be applied globally. And this is also one of the questions that came in the Q&A about changes and shifts to new innovations and digital transformation and how this will impact women in mining. Actually, I'm proud to say that the project that I mentioned before, the project that IGF is jointly launching with International Women in Mining, International Labour Organization, and the Environmental Governance Program of UNDP and Swedish Environmental Agency, is designed to answer these questions and challenges. And all the countries that we hosted today, South Africa, Canada, and Colombia, are pilot countries in this research, and I really hope that we can give you more answers soon. And just related to this, my colleague David has just posted a link for our upcoming 17th annual general meeting. IGF's AGM is the leading international forum on mining policy and sustainable development. And this year's session topics include ASM, climate change, critical minerals, taxation, and of course, gender equality. And a little teaser on our gender session, which can help us take this discussion forward to a next level. This year, we will focus on the changing roles, opportunities, and challenges for women in mining in the face of the fourth industrial revolution that is characterized by the transition to a low carbon economy and adaptation of new technologies and automation. So I think this will be a great opportunity to pick up this conversation in less than 3 weeks and to continue this discussion. Well, I'm so sorry that today's we're out of time for more questions, and I'm so sorry that we couldn't take more questions. But let's commit, Jennifer, to have another webinar soon and to pick up on the main issues that came out today, like data, technologies, and corporate and public policies working hand in hand to bring solutions to these issues. Of course, also ASM. ASM is something that we did not touch up until today, but I think there is a lot to unpack there. And can I leave the floor to you, Jennifer, for the last few words?
For sure. Many thanks. Again, it's been such a rich conversation. It's difficult to cut it short at this moment, but absolutely to be followed up by further conversations. So just to say, it's been fantastic to hear these fantastic examples of resources that can be used by governments as models to develop their own regulatory tools and other instruments. I think we have got much more to be learned from both corporate and public side. I think there's definitely a synergies there to be exploited. And so wishing everybody good luck in using all this information, and please come back to us with any questions that we weren't able to address today, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again in other events. Many thanks indeed for the collaboration with IGF, and wishing everybody well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you everyone for participating, and hoping to see you in 3 weeks in our AGM. Thank you very much, everyone.